Opening the center, it immediately challenges black for central space and opens diagonals for bishops. Carving out space for the queen and preparing to challenge the center, this pawn advance sets a solid defensive foundation. Solidifying central influence by occupying more space immediately challenges black's nascent defensive setup. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn thrust creates dynamic tension and seeks active piece play. Carving out a significant space advantage, this pawn push immediately restricts black's pieces and dictates the early strategic battle for control of the center. Immediately contesting the center with pawn thrusts intensifies the positional struggle, seeking to dismantle white's space advantage. Embracing the open lines, white gambits a pawn for central control and freer development. Challenging white's pawn chain directly, black opens lines for piece development, aiming to disrupt the center. Securing the queen's pawn advance with a pawn sacrifice, a3 now prepares to solidify central control and hinder black's queenside expansion. Unleashing the bishop here opens lines for counterplay, actively engaging white's pawn chain while preparing piece development. Solidifying central control becomes paramount now, as white develops a knight towards the kingside, aiming to contribute to the growing pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and prepare for castling. Developing the knight towards the center offers flexibility, preparing to castle kingside and potentially contest the d-file, while also freeing the f8 square for bishop development and ensuring the king's safety, a crucial step in the early middle game. Developing the bishop to its natural outpost on the light squares, this piece now eyes the kingside and reinforces the central pawn structure, preparing for potential castling and a coordinated attack. Centralizing the knight and preparing to contest the d4 square, this maneuver seeks to activate the piece from its somewhat passive starting position and opens a pathway for the f8 bishop. Securely tucking the king away prepares for the middle game struggle and unchains the queen from defensive duties, allowing for more active central play and pressure on black's somewhat exposed queenside pawns. Securing the monarch against potential central thrusts now allows black to concentrate on developing the remaining pieces and contesting the open files, a prudent step after a slight pawn sacrifice. Expanding the queenside pawn structure aims to create space and potentially disrupt black's developing harmony, but it simultaneously weakens the light squares and offers a target for black's active pieces, particularly the bishop on c5. Preparing to develop the queenside and connect the rooks, black subtly reinforces the pawn chain and activates a piece that was previously blocked. This thoughtful repositioning aims to improve coordination and prepares for potential central pawn breaks later in the game, setting a solid foundation for counterplay. Unlocking diagonals for the queen and bishop, this development prepares for central expansion and potential attacks on the queenside. Unleashing the knight towards f4 creates immediate pressure on white's kingside, aiming to disrupt the harmonious placement of white's pieces and potentially open lines for a future attack. Centralizing the knight on c3 offers white excellent influence over the d5 and e4 squares, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn pushes like c4 or even a future d4 expansion once the knight is properly supported. Black boldly challenges white's queenside pawn chain, aiming to dismantle the advanced b4 pawn and potentially open the file for piece activity, while simultaneously creating space for their own pieces to maneuver more freely. Expanding aggressively to claim central territory, this pawn thrust aims to cramp black's queenside structure and potentially isolate the isolated pawn on c5, forcing concessions and creating enduring weaknesses. Asserting control over the queenside pawn structure, black reinforces their foothold and prepares to potentially harass white's advanced b5 pawn. That bishop's journey back to c1 signifies a strategic repositioning, a tempo sacrifice to reroute its influence. Instead of continuing its forward march, it retreats to defend the king from potential kingside thrusts and prepare for a more active role in controlling the light squares, perhaps eyeing the d2 or e3 squares for a later redeployment, aiming to bolster the pawn structure or participate in a central counterattack. This reassesses the board's dynamics, prioritizing safety and long-term positional harmony over immediate pawn capture, acknowledging black's energetic counterplay on the queen side. Exchanging the knight for the bishop here is a decisive positional concession, immediately simplifying the board and potentially opening a path for white's queen to become more active on the now liberated d-file. The dark-squared bishop on c5 was a crucial defensive piece for black, controlling key diagonals and offering support to the king side. Losing it simplifies white's task of coordinating their pieces, particularly the rook on f1, which can now eye the f7 pawn more freely. Furthermore, this exchange removes a dynamic attacking force from black's lineup, leaving them with fewer immediate threats. Opening the c-file now presents a clear target for the rooks, while simultaneously bolstering the pawn structure on the queen side. Unlocking the d-file for your queen and rook, the knight pivots towards a more active role, preparing to contest central control and potentially raid white's king side if the opportunity arises, all while reinforcing the pawn chain structure and limiting white's piece mobility along the queen side. Initiating a central rook lift, white prepares to swing this piece over to the king side, seeking to support an eventual pawn push like f4 or even to create attacking opportunities along the open files that may arise. The move also subtly discourages black's potential queenside expansion by adding pressure to the c6 pawn, which currently looks somewhat loose without immediate pawn support. This is a patient maneuvering piece, aiming to improve white's piece harmony and create a more flexible structure before committing to a decisive attack. Reclaiming central space and preparing for potential knight outposts are the immediate goals as the nc5 emerges to a more active square. This knight repositions itself to a more threatening central square, directly challenging white's queenside pawn structure and offering potential disruptions. The move also prepares for further activity by potentially supporting a subsequent d4 push or rerouting to other key squares. It's a dynamic repositioning aimed at generating counterplay and exploiting the current slight imbalance in piece activity. Unleashing the knight to d4 injects dynamic potential into white's position, targeting the pawn on c6 and creating a clear outpost for the knight should black allow it. This maneuver aims to disrupt black's queenside structure and offers white a significant initiative, potentially forcing concessions or opening lines for further action. Unlocking a blocked pawn chain, this maneuver immediately challenges the central structure and seeks to disrupt white's pieces, especially the knight on d4. It's a dynamic choice, aiming to create counterplay on the king side while simultaneously opening lines for the rook on f8, hinting at an aggressive intent beyond mere defense. The pawn push is a gamble, potentially creating weaknesses, but it's a necessary risk to avoid passive play and inject life into black's position. This pawn thrust might open a path for the queen to join the action, but it also creates potential targets for white's pieces, demanding precise follow-up. Such a move often signals a desire to break free from confinement, forcing white to react to black's initiative rather than dictating the game. Challenging the knight's established outpost, this bishop maneuver aims to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure while simultaneously preparing for potential central advances, potentially opening lines for white's rooks. Opening up the f-file with a pawn thrust feels aggressive, aiming to unsettle white's slightly cramped position, yet it risks creating a permanent weakness on e6 if the advance is repulsed. Reactivating the bishop to its originating square may seem counterintuitive after a busy excursion, but it sets a strategic trap by potentially luring the knight further into white's attacking zone on the king side, or preparing a more fluid central reorganization once black's pieces commit. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, black boldly injects dynamism into this already sharp position, seeking to overwhelm white's central structure and potentially open lines towards the enemy monarch. The rook embarks on a journey to b1, aiming to solidify the protection of that pawn, a seemingly minor defensive measure, yet one that prevents a potential future pawn push by black on the queen side, thereby securing valuable territory. Black seeks to redeploy the queen, aiming to support the pawn push on f4 and potentially create attacking chances on the king side. But this maneuver risks leaving the queen exposed and might concede valuable central space if white can effectively challenge the d-file. Repositioning the knight to f3 offers a chance to develop the kingside further, aiming to connect rooks and potentially contest the e-file, while also freeing up the e-pawn's advance and guarding against potential immediate threats around the king. Unleashing the queen to h6 creates significant diagonal pressure, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially target the g2 square. Unlocking the central d-file, this advance boldly challenges black's queenside structure and initiates a potential pawn storm by creating more space for white's pieces to maneuver. Pushing the knight to d3, a surprisingly active outpost, forces white to confront a concrete positional challenge, potentially disrupting their carefully constructed pawn chain and opening up the e-file for counterplay. Preparing to dislodge black's aggressive knight on d3, white repositions the rook to the e-file, aiming to coordinate with the other rook and potentially contest the open file or support a future pawn push. Black tidies up the bishop, bringing it to a more active diagonal and eyeing the weakened kingside squares. Realigning the bishop to a more active diagonal, this repositioning aims to bolster the kingside defense while simultaneously preparing for potential queenside counterplay, creating a more unified pawn structure. Committing the rook to the c-file signifies a bold intention to contest this crucial open highway, aiming to displace white's entrenched knight and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around the d-pawn. Seizing the initiative, white boldly ventures the knight to the queenside outpost, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and exploit potential weaknesses on the file, a move that gambles on the board's currently congested state. A daring knight sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially unravel their queenside pawn structure, but it risks opening lines for the opposing king if black's follow-up isn't precise. Sacrificing the rook on f2 initiates a daring counter-gambit, aiming to disrupt black's increasingly cohesive central pawn structure and exploit the open f-file, potentially creating swift attacking opportunities against the black king. Placing the rook on the open file creates immediate pressure and demands a response, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and potentially disrupt white's coordination. The rook finds a more active square, aiming to pressure the advanced black pawn and potentially leverage the open file should black neglect its defense. Sacrificing the rook to dismantle white's queenside pawns presents an intriguing tactical puzzle, aiming to expose the king's safety through open lines and active piece play rather than a direct material advantage. Reclaiming the queen after the rook exchange stabilizes white's center and prepares for a potential counterattack, aiming to exploit black's potentially exposed king by consolidating pieces. The rook's relocation to c4 injects immediate dynamism, challenging white's now awkwardly placed queen and preparing to infiltrate the queenside. The queen's repositioning to b2 aims to break the stalemate on the queenside and contest the open c-file, putting immediate pressure on black's disconnected rook and potential pawn advances. Harnessing the tempo gained by the queen's relocation, this maneuver aims to disrupt white's nascent queenside pressure by forcing an exchange of the vital d3 pawn, potentially opening lines for black's active pieces and relieving the cramped position. Clearing the bishop from that active square opens up crucial diagonal lines for infiltration, transforming a static structure into a dynamic battlefield where piece activity will dictate survival. Black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure by sacrificing material for activity, hoping to exploit the exposed white king. A bold attempt to reclaim the initiative by leveraging the queen's diagonal influence, aiming to disrupt black's suddenly commanding rook presence on the c-file and perhaps force exchanges that simplify the overwhelming material disadvantage. Capturing the rook on a3 seems tempting, but it opens up the queen's diagonal to your king, turning a potentially winning position into a precarious one. Securing the pawn on a4 feels like a desperate measure, as the initiative has firmly shifted to black's queenside pressure. White's king now appears more exposed with the g2 square undefended, and the long-term positional ramifications of allowing black such active piece play are deeply concerning. The rook's return to the third rank creates an interesting, albeit risky, repositioning that aims to exploit the suddenly exposed white king, but it overlooks the immediate tactical dangers lurking on the queenside pawns. Shifting the queen to the d-file creates an immediate threat of doubling rooks on that open line, potentially overwhelming black's bishop and pawn structure. Unburdening the queen signals a pivotal moment, simplifying into an endgame where black's slightly better pawn structure on the queenside might become a factor, although white's centralized pieces and open c-file still offer significant compensation for the sacrificed material. Consolidating the bishop on a more central diagonal offers a more active post, ready to influence the d7 pawn and potentially support advances on the queenside while preparing to defend the king. A thoughtful pause before the endgame truly kicks into gear. This unassuming pawn push subtly reinforces the kingside's integrity. Fortifying that central pawn chain, the bishop retreats to a more robust defensive post, ready to support its brethren and potentially launch a counterattack on the queenside if the opportunity arises, all while keeping a watchful eye on the e5 pawn's security. Repositioning the bishop to guard that crucial a3 square now becomes paramount, aiming to solidify the queenside and prevent further incursions. Shifting the bishop to the queenside redeploys its defensive pressure, aiming to stifle the initiative black has gained on the open c-file and disrupt their piece coordination. Reconnecting the bishop to its dormant battery on the kingside offers a potential for future activity. But for now, the piece faces an awkward passive stance, shielded by its own pawns and largely irrelevant to the unfolding central struggle. Securing the king's position becomes paramount. Placing it on the second rank avoids any awkward discovery threats from black's rook on the c-file, and also prepares a potential escape route via g3 should the need arise. Seeking to seize the initiative by expanding on the queenside, this advance aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create new avenues for the rook.